So, Vincent, if you could very briefly describe what is it that you're doing right now, because you're also an activist. So, thank you, first of all, for being on here. And so, please, if you could very briefly tell our audience what is it that you do?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I got involved with anti-war organizing after I refused a third deployment to Iraq. So back in 2006, I was coming home from my second deployment to Iraq with the United States Marine Corps, refused a third deployment, and immediately joined the anti-war movement. And I'm sure, as you know, once you get involved with one issue, your horizons broaden. You start to see how all of these issues are connected. And so that led me to the environmental movement, that led me to various other movements. And now, in the midst of the pandemic, well, I should back up a little bit. 4 years ago, we opened a community center in Michigan City called Politics, Art, Roots, Culture. So 4 years ago, we opened the space, and the space was used for a wide range of activities, mostly organizing efforts, but also live music performances, poetry slams, art installations, documentary film screenings, guest lectures, soup kitchens, coat drives, and anything else that you could imagine. So, as a community cultural center, we tried to bring together all of those elements and into sort of one project and combine it with our political efforts here in Michigan City. And as a result of the pandemic, we've had to temporarily close our doors, and we started what is now a podcast and a YouTube program called Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, Media. So we interview people, we interview organizers, activists, intellectuals, authors, our friends, our family, and anyone that's doing interesting work or people we want to have conversations with. And it's allowed us to keep the doors open here at the community space because we have a Patreon set up. So we've been able to keep the lights on and keep the doors open until it's safe to have people re-enter.
Why is it that you decided not to take that, the third draft? Because I've seen, for instance, that there's this really famous TED Talks, got millions of views on the soldier describing, how horrible it was to be a soldier. But I'm actually interested, what is it that turned you off? Because we don't have a draft. I mean, you enlisted. Was it peer pressure around in your community, the thing that everybody was doing, perhaps maybe to get some free education? What was it that turned you off and made you take such a radically different approach? So what was it?
Yes, the food was terrible. It was a combination of many things. So the short answer is drugs, friends, and books. So when I got home from my first deployment, I started to experiment more and more with psychedelics. So, and I'm not going to get into some hippy dippy thing where if you eat mushrooms and LSD, you're going to become one with the universe and you're going to understand everything. No, I do think it's a tool, and it's a tool to, I think, allow yourself a certain level of introspective reflection, certain level of humility and vulnerability where you're coming home from this very traumatic experience. And of course, to back up, psychedelics go back with ancient cultures, indigenous cultures, for over 10,000 years. So it used to be used.
How prevalent is this among soldiers?
Very prevalent.
Okay.
Yeah, very prevalent. Yeah, I would say a lot of returning servicemen and women dabble with psychedelic substances, and there's reasons for that. I mean, this again goes back to indigenous cultures who've used these substances, especially for warriors and spiritual ceremonies and various rituals. Wasn't to be used to take it and go to a concert. It's to be used to take it, reflect on life, think about life and death, think about your place in the universe, and all of those things. So that helped. On top of that, my friends were coming home from university and they were taking, classes in the humanities. So they were getting schooled up in, anti-imperialist, anti-war, anti-empire sort of thinking that was going on at the university campuses in the US back in 2003, 2004, 2005. And at the same time, I started reading a lot of books. I started reading Noam Chomsky. I started reading Cornel West, Howard Zinn, a whole number of people. And the combination of those three things, thinking, reflecting, questioning my own values, talking with my friends and family about those things, and then contextualizing it through reading. Those three things are really what flipped me. On top of course, after the second deployment, that deployment was particularly brutal, and we came home. And, while I was there, obviously decided that I did not want to participate anymore. So
Okay.
I don't want to get into too many of the details about that because it's something I've talked about at length in the past. I testified to Congress about it. The short answer is, Marines were killing a lot of innocent civilians, torturing prisoners, mutilating dead bodies, stealing weapons and munitions, planting weapons on dead Iraqis. Like, these were the things that were happening regularly through the first 4 or 5 years of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And some of those things continue today, as we see with news reports, and it's not just U.S. forces, Australian Defense Forces, British troops, and U.S. soldiers who've committed those atrocities and war crimes. So
what then would you propose that the army then changes into? I mean, are you then proposing countries just abolish their army? Like, how would you then advance American interests abroad? Or how would you bring about peace in the world? Occupying other countries.
Yeah, well, I guess it's a fundamental question about what the United States military does. Is it, in fact, a stabilizing force, or is it a destabilizing force? And if we're interested in democracy and sovereignty, if, in fact, people want the United States and democratically choose to have the United States come to their country to help them with any number of things, that's fine. But I don't see countries asking the United States to do that. Now, country elites within countries might be doing that, politicians, corporations, et cetera, banks. But the people of most countries around the world, including Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, and so on, they do not want the United States to occupy, bomb, strafe their countries, or inject weapons and funds and logistical information to various paramilitary organizations. So most people don't want that. And your question about advancing American interests is an interesting question, because I think we always have to ask ourselves, whose interests are we talking about? My interests are not the same as, obviously, Bill Gates. Your interests are not the same as Elon Musk's. So I think, reframing questions around what it means to be, a nation in a world of 7.8 billion people in the context of global climate change and pandemics. Like, these are the kinds of things, I think, the kinds of questions that we have to ask. In terms of abolishing the military, no, I don't believe in that, because I do think that you might very well run into a situation where, let's take like the most positive example. Let's say left-wing socialist progressive forces take power in the United States. Do we assume that once that happens, that there will no longer be fascist or right-wing governments in the world? Because if, in fact, those governments continue to grow, and if they form various regional blocks or power bases, like, what's going to happen? Like, this was something the Soviet Union ran into, obviously, during World War II, fighting fascism. Like, there was a need for an army, hopefully not to put down innocent people and poor working class people around the world, but to also defend yourself against what, could be rising right-wing forces. And I think that's a real question people on the left need to ask.
Yeah. I actually like the position, let's say, I wouldn't call it a compromising position, but more like realistic. I like how Tulsi Gabbard, for instance, made so mainstream the whole issue of regime change wars. How it was so embarrassing to see establishment media talking heads going on about, well, what exactly is regime change wars? It's like they've been covering these things that you don't even know what they're called.
Right.
And I also like how Bernie Sanders, for instance, has a really excellent relationship with veterans. It's interesting that you mentioned, and I have heard you say this before, how, quite obviously, other countries do not want to be bombed. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to get really regional and local on this one, because I actually have heard Cuban Americans down here in Florida say that they do want the Marines to invade.
Sure.
And so they
sure.
I'm certain you've.
But like the people of Cuba, if they were polled, they would say no.
That the Marines will drop, chicken and ham down the Malecón in La Habana, sort of slow motion care packages arriving, and democracy as well. What would you say to those people? Like, I would love to just get a clip of this, and there's just little subtitles in Spanish so they can hear from, a former Marine.
Look, I don't know if we're going to change everyone's minds. I mean, I to your point, the point I was making earlier is that democratically, if you were to poll the people of Cuba, overwhelmingly, they would say, please do not bomb our country. Please do not interfere. It is true that we're going to find people who believe in such things. I am of the thinking that we should focus more on the people who remain on the fence. Those people, the millions of people in this country who are like, I don't know, should we? Is Cuba good? Is Cuba bad? I don't really know. Those are the people that I try to focus on, because the people who are already like ideologically and politically dug in my experience, there's not much of a conversation to be had. Most times, unless those people are very close to you and they trust you and they're really willing to like engage in long-term discussions over a certain period of time.
How different do you think Joe Biden's foreign policy is going to be compared to Trump's?
When it comes to U.S. foreign policy, I think historically it's clear that there's much more continuity than difference between Democratic and Republican presidents. This goes far beyond, I think, Biden and Trump. I mean, this goes back well over 100 years, definitely in the post-World War II era, where there's been a bipartisan consensus about the United States' place in the world and our sort of willingness and so-called responsibility to sort of dominate the world. So, you know, the U.S. has been a full-blown empire for a long time. We'll say post-World War II era, but definitely following the Spanish-American War in 1898. So do I expect there to be many differences between Biden and Trump? No, I expect there to be much more continuity than differences. Of course, we're concerned. I think anyone in the anti-war movement, I think, well, to the extent that there is an anti-war movement, I think people who are interested in U.S. foreign policy are extremely concerned, because Joe Biden has surrounded himself with the so-called humanitarian interventionists and hawks that, you know, populated the Obama administration, even going back to the Bush administration. As far as differences, specific differences, I mean, the good thing, of course, is that I think Joe Biden will hopefully re-engage with the Iran nuclear deal. That's something that would be a positive. On the bad end, of course, we see a continuation, full stop, of Trump's policies towards Venezuela and the recognition that Guaido is the legitimate leader of the country. So that's going to continue. What the relationships look like throughout Latin America will be interesting. I don't know how much different that will look. Same thing with Cuba, perhaps a little different than Trump, but I don't think significantly. As far as Europe's concerned, of course, the primary challenge I think that we have is making sure the Biden administration doesn't ramp up a sort of a new Cold War tensions with Russia. Of course, I think there was a myth that Trump was in the pocket of the Russians. Most of the policies towards the Russians over the last 4 years have not been pretty, from the sanctions to continuing to surround Russia with ballistic missile systems and various other forms of economic warfare as well, including meddling in Ukraine and so on. So, you know, what does the relationship look like vis-a-vis China? That'll be interesting, because I think the Biden administration will try and reinvigorate some form of the TPP, which is already being sort of reinvigorated by the countries that were involved with it the first time around when Obama was in power. So many differences? No. It would be good to continue dialogue with North Korea. But again, you know, I don't see anything fundamentally changing. And I think there's a good reason for that too. I mean, I think we see some capitulation on behalf of the Biden administration, but only where there's pressure. I mean, the reason I had noted earlier that there's not really an anti-war movement, it's like that's reflected, I think, in the fact that someone like Tulsi Gabbard is sort of on the margins of the Democratic Party. Like, there is not a base of supporters for someone like a Tulsi Gabbard within the Democratic Party. And that's because there's largely not an anti-war movement that's organized anymore. I mean, it needs to happen. Of course, we have to reinvigorate it. But if you look around the country and you ask, like, what national anti-war organizations exist and how many members do they have and what kind of campaigns are they engaged in, it's very slim right now.
What would you advise then people to vote? Because there's the path of voting the lesser of two evils, or maybe go third party, or no vote at all, which is baloney. It's not an option. So what would you advise people do?
My advice to people is
vote according to your conscience. None of that.
Yeah, no. I think people should be very strategic, and I think we have to understand power. I mean, for me, there's a difference between I think there's an interesting conversation taking place on the left right now about the difference between punditry and organizing. So on the one end, we need political pundits. Like, we need people to be out there to call out the BS. I don't want to swear on your program, but, you know, like, people to call out the BS of the mainstream media, to call out the BS of the elite politicians. Like, we need that. Like, I see a space for that kind of commentary. But I also think there's a difference between looking at the world that way and then looking at the world as, say, an organizer. And if you're an organizer, you're looking at what is the landscape of power? So where we live, or anywhere else really in the United States, like the last presidential election, the question for me isn't like, in other words, you can't have it both ways. On the one end, we have leftists who are like, voting isn't that big of a deal. And then it's like, oh, I voted for Joe Biden last election. It's like, you're a traitor to the cause. And it's like, well, wait a minute. If voting isn't such a big deal and it's just like this defense mechanism, which is how I look at it, like it's a strategic tool and a mechanism that we have to use in a survival mechanism within an extremely dysfunctional system that's very undemocratic. So like, no, I don't know anyone except for like, crazy people who watch too much cable news, which is a dwindling number of Americans who get like really pumped to go to the voting booth. Like most people I know in this last election, they showed up, they voted for Joe Biden. They didn't want to. They wanted to get rid of Trump. They thought it made sense to get rid of Trump. And then they went home and they were like, oh shit, now we're stuck with Joe Biden. And now this isn't going to be good either. But they at least like, I don't know, there's a weird, I'm not saying this the best way that I probably could say it today, but I'm thinking of all of the things you mentioned. And it's like, it seems to me to be two fundamentally different ways that people can look at the world. And you can look at the world as like, I'm just analyzing this thing. Is this thing good or is it bad? And then you can look at the world as like, I want to shape this thing. So how am I going to shape it? So how are we going to get people elected? Like Green Party people, third party, Labor Party people, like these people who are trying to start these new parties need to go back and talk to the people who've tried to start third parties in this country for the last 50 years. There is no hope for third party organizing in the United States. So whoever, and I've had these conversations for the last 15 years of being an organizer, the same people today who are like, oh, it's the People's Party and there's never been a better time. In 2 or 3 years, that'll be over with. In fact, I would argue within a couple years, that project won't even exist. Like the dozens of third party projects I've seen start up or try to start up over the last 15 years, and all of them smolder out. So as far as the squad's concerned, like I like people. Should AOC be criticized? Hell yes, she should be criticized. But I think that it should be done with a sense of solidarity because I like people who actually get stuff done. So like, am I more impressed with this woman who comes from a working class background and was a bartender and is now passing legislation that's like helping poor and working class people? Yes, I'm like much more interested and impressed with her than I am some YouTube commentator who wants to talk crap about her. Like, yeah, it's not even like, it's like hands down, I'm more interested in people who get stuff done in like the material world. I'm not interested in like
infiltrating the party and pushing them to the left.
I don't know. I mean, look at the last round of legislation. The question is for people out there.
Republicans are doing it. That's what Marjorie Taylor Greene said she was doing. That she was trying to push the Republicans.
Who, Marjorie?
Yeah, she said that. She said she was going to push the Republicans to the right. So clearly, there are some that are doing it. And
yeah,
the United States stands on the political spectrum, obviously, very much to the right.
Yes.
AOC is not going to turn America socialist. Not anytime soon.
No, but I mean, my thing is like, do we expect a single individual or 4 or 5 members within this body of people to like, turn the United States into a socialist country? No, it's like everybody who's sitting at home watching our interview today, like all of us have a responsibility in our communities, in our workplaces. Like, what are we doing to organize to get more and more people elected to Congress on top of workplace organizing, on top of community organizing, on top of tenant organizing, on top of student organizing? We need unemployed workers organized, homeless people, elderly people, single moms. Everybody should be organized. So like, for people that, I think my problem with this, because we're like on the ground doing shit and have been for years, is like there's too many people who, with this thing that exists today, this webcam and this computer, which can serve some beneficial purposes, but also drives me nuts sometimes, have like all of these things to say from the sideline. And I always ask people, what kind of organizing efforts have you been involved with? I immediately, when somebody has an opinion about like, oh, we should do this, or these people should do this, I say, what organizing efforts have you been involved with, and what have you been able to accomplish in the places where you've lived? hey, it turns out this works really hard. It turns out we live in a really difficult time in a really difficult country to do stuff. And like, that's why I say that I really, really appreciate people who actually get stuff done. It's never going to be like as good as whatever all of us want it to be. But like, if people are making progress and actually winning victories for poor and working class people, stuff that makes a difference in people's lives, that matters to me, you know? And I think we should do everything we can to like help and bolster those efforts, not just like crap on them all the time.
So how do you do that? How do you get people to not think that you're just somebody who's just trying to make a business out of it and actually want what's best for them? Because people have gotten very cynical.
People have gotten extremely cynical. I think for me, part of what plays into that is that I've been doing this work for a long time. I mean, I'm 36 years old now, and I've been doing it, I mean, with every ounce of my being since I was 22 years old. Haven't worked for any major NGOs, have always worked part-time jobs, construction, landscaping, bartending, working in restaurants, like to sort of, to like supplement the kind of work that I really want to do, which is political organizing and activism. So, and I also have never been someone who's been like asking people for money for a long time. So like the first time I've ever asked for people for money over those 15 years were when our doors temporarily closed to the community center. And even when we had the community center open, it was like people came. Sometimes people give $1. Sometimes people give $20. Sometimes we'd have benefit concerts to like raise enough money to keep the doors open. But people, I think to some degree, have built up enough trust among people who know me and people within movements and organizations where they know where I'm coming from and they know that I'm not, you know, so that helps in terms of credibility, just having like enough background and experience. But I also think you're asking a great question because nobody's quite figured it out in the context of COVID. Now, I think it matters who you are. In other words, I know Amazon workers are organizing right now because they're forced to go to work and their lives on the factory floor don't look much different in those warehouses today under COVID than they did, say, a year ago or 2 years ago. So if you're a worker at Amazon, or if you're a restaurant worker, or if you're a worker at a grocery store or retail place, like you're going to work today and have been for the last 11 months like you did the 11 months before that. So in terms of workplace organizing efforts, I think there's a ton of potential. And we've seen that right now. We've got a union vote happening in Alabama with Amazon workers at a warehouse stationed located in Alabama. That's a historic and important vote because that could very well cause a ripple effect throughout the South of organizing efforts within factories. Many of those factories had been moved to the South during the 1960s and 70s. You know, factories that used to exist in union states like Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, New York, Massachusetts. Then all of these corporations moved those factories to the South, then to Mexico, then to the Philippines and China. But some of them remained in the South and they've been non-unionized like for a long time. So I think that's like tremendous efforts that people can look to for inspiration. Electoral victories. Now, not the kind of Bernie Sanders style candidates I would have liked to have seen, but I'm glad that the two candidates in Georgia won. Well, that was the effort of a lot of people, like the effort of black churches, black student organizations. The Teamsters had 100,000 union members on the ground in Georgia or across the country calling voters in Georgia. Those kind of efforts happened during COVID. We set up a citywide mutual aid network as soon as it kicked off here in Michigan City. Following on top of that, our local organizing body, Organized and United Residents of Michigan City, started a citywide mutual aid network within the first month of the pandemic, carried that through. Then a few months after that, started a tenants organizing campaign at a local apartment complex. I'm not going to name the complex because it's ongoing efforts and we're not trying to advertise to everyone that that's where we're organizing, just the tenants who are there. So those have been things that have been going on. We worked with the Black Lives Matter movement over the summer. We've started a DSA chapter, why are we starting a Democratic Socialists of America chapter here in Northwest Indiana? Well, because in a state like Indiana.
How many members are you going to have?
What'd you say?
How many members are you going to have?
Hey, we actually have 40, 50 people attending weekly organizing sessions every Sunday at 3 p.m. Yeah, I mean, so we got 40 or 50 people attending Zoom sessions every Sunday at 3 p.m. for power mapping, strategic planning analysis. We're doing SWOT training this week. So like strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, all kinds of like organizing workshops that you would do if you're about to kick off a campaign. The reason we had to do that, and I think it's important to note this for people who might be watching who live in Republican controlled states. In Indiana, we live in what is called a trifecta controlled state. So the Republicans control both the House, the state Senate, and the governorship. They have a supermajority in the House and the Senate, and the governor is a total right-wing lunatic. Okay, so they've passed this series of laws in the state of Indiana that bar municipalities and counties from passing their own legislation. So like in Indiana, it is illegal for municipalities to raise the minimum wage above what the state is. It's illegal for municipalities to charge taxes. So like at the municipal level, we can't control corporate tax, income tax, property tax. That's all controlled downstate. There's a series of those preemptive laws. We can't say pass marijuana legally at the municipal level or decriminalize it here at the municipal level in Indiana because it's illegal downstate. So all of that, the reason I'm saying all of this is that if you don't have a national network, if you don't focus on both local and national politics and at the state level, how all of those things interplay with each other, there's very little to get accomplished in a place like Indiana simply doing local organizing because you can promise people, hey, we want to give you universal health care. But if you have no power to do that at the municipal level, you're selling people a lot of BS, and I don't think that's really helpful. So, you know, those are the kind of things that we're dealing with. Yeah. Does that make sense? Like in terms of the DSA stuff, like why we would do, because I don't want, because I think it's really important for people who might be watching this again and who live in states like where we live, who will recognize the limitations of doing local activism, that like local organizing efforts can only yield so much in a state like this. You really have to have statewide efforts, and those statewide efforts have to be connected to a national effort. And without huge federal government programs, we don't have much of a chance in Indiana because our economy and our state budget isn't big enough to do the kind of universal programs that we need. So without big, massive state government intervention, there's no hope for the kind of programs that we need.
Do you think it's bad or good that the way that Generation Z is approaching politics? They're just listening to each other. They're following each other like, oh, this other so-and-so who used to do makeup tutorials or used to stream on Twitch, now so-and-so, who is kind of like their age, now has a political opinion. Do you think that's good, or can that go potentially very, very bad?
I think it depends. I've seen examples of both. I mean, I've seen people who have shifted into thinking on a very deep level about politics, and that's good because if it can bring ordinary people into the political realm that otherwise would never be engaged or exposed to this kind of stuff, that's great if it's done in a thoughtful way. To your point, if it's done in a toxic way that's unhelpful, or counterproductive and turns people off.
Online, yes.
Yeah, I mean that
the young and vulnerable.
That's no good. I mean, look, how do I put this? I am not too hard on I'm not too critical of specific generations because I see it both ways. Like my younger friends always are talking, negatively about the baby boomers, and I say, well, look, I mean, look at what some of the baby boomers accomplished in the 1960s and 70s. They were able to accomplish more than our generations have accomplished since then. Now, that's not a direct indictment.
Because the baby boomers have sabotaged us. I'm kidding.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, it's like, I think everybody deserves a lot. And as I get older now, like I'm feeling that where I'm like, shit, like when I came about in this work, it was a long time ago. Like things have changed significantly. And
yeah,
I look at people who are, middle-aged people doing this work have a ton to offer. There's younger people who have a ton to offer. And yes, I do think they need to get offline. They need to learn how to socialize better. But who was it that created that world for them? It wasn't as if these people came out of their mom's wombs and then all of a sudden had a freaking iPhone in their hand. Like their moms and their dads gave them that. Like baby boomers and Gen Xers and millennials gave these newer, younger generations the world in which they're living in. So it's like
the good and the bad.
The good and the bad. Exactly. And I wish we could just have more conversations in that vein instead of like, the younger generation or the older generation.
What do you think about that whole constant?
There's a lot
ping pong table of battle going on online that really does have ramifications in the real world. because we're going down the road through Trump's second impeachment. So all these wars from different influencers and different hashtags, all these online things that at first you could say, oh, but who cares? Why are we going on wasting our time with these culture wars? Who cares about Ben Shapiro criticizing WAP, right? Or the song from Cardi B. Like, these conversations are no longer just harmless little hobbies that we have on the internet. They have real ramifications in the real world. What is your take on where all this is headed? Because I seriously would not want a Twitter war to end up causing a civil war, because that's what some of my friends actually are afraid of now.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's interesting. On the one end, I think it is a problem. It's a new medium, and it's been hoisted upon us in the last 30 years, and no one asked for it. Again, it's not like we democratically came to the consensus in the United States that we all wanted to carry a cell phone with us all the time. It just happened overnight. I remember in 2014, I got my first iPhone, and I was like, for a long time, held off, was like, I don't need a smartphone. I don't need this. I don't need that. And then all of a sudden, life became
I got this. My first one in 2018. So,
hey, right on. Right on. That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, look, it is new, and it does cause new challenges and problems, though. The more I read history, I think it's really important for people to remember that people in this country have been ransacking, burning, torturing, hanging, killing, slaughtering, and genocidally murdering each other long before the iPhones, the internet, Twitter, social media, and before electricity, and so on and so on. So on the one end, I think you ask a very important question. We have a new medium out there today. It is very powerful. Otherwise, extremely powerful entities like corporations and governments and others would not use it. On the other hand, I think that sometimes the concerns about social media are often a little bit inflated. And I think when we look back at history, like, plenty of Americans were violent and mean to each other before Twitter existed. And we can also argue that in many worse ways. So yes, as bad as things seem today, and they are bad, like, half of the country is not formed into militias and paramilitary groups ready to kill the other half of the country. And like, so it's like today, like when people talk about a civil war, I'm like, what, who? I'm like, who are we talking about? Like, no one is organized. Like, if we're talking about like the Biden voters who just showed up to vote for Biden, or the Trump supporters who show up to his rallies every now and then like show up to the voting booth and then troll people online,
or they try to siege the Capitol.
Yeah, now that, well, look, I do think there's a real question to be had about, and this is where I disagreed with a lot of my left friends.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, no.
Very much inflated and taken out of context.
No, 100%. My point was that I think it's really important that we take that seriously, because there's a historian by the name of Kathleen Belew who teaches at the University of Chicago. She wrote a book called Bring the War Home. It's like a history of the last 45 years of the white power movement in paramilitary America. And it's really important for people to recognize that, like, events like January 6th, events like the bombing in Nashville, going all the way back to Ruby Ridge and Waco and Oklahoma City and beyond that, like, these are the same
sort of people.
I mean, they're the same paramilitary forces who came home from Vietnam, became radicalized in opposition to the feminist movement, in opposition to the Black rights movement, Black power movement, in opposition to socialist movement, and then started training paramilitary forces in Nicaragua and El Salvador throughout the 1980s, and right-wing forces. This is like right up through the 1990s when they became paramilitary forces, like the type Timothy McVeigh hung out with, that eventually decided that their number one goal was to destroy the federal government. I mean, all of this then becomes wrapped up in the early 2000s with like Ron Paul, Alex Jones. I could go on and on, this like ecosystem of right-wing thought that's existed in the internet as like this, oh, it's kind of cute. Like, we kind of like watching Alex Jones. Like, he's kind of funny. I think people should take all of that a lot more seriously. I think there's a reason why Trump supporters are, act and look like they won the election, and Democrats are at home, like, scared and cowering and don't really know what to do. And right-wing activists are like, we know exactly what to do. Like, this is our country, and we're going to act like it's our country.
So we're going to be wrapping this up because I've already stolen an hour of your time.
That's okay. Can I just say a couple things?
Yeah,
because you said so much about in the last thing that I just wanted to mention two things.
I know, I just rambled.
No. It's all like, I'm writing down, like, as you're talking, I was like, yeah, that's another one. There's a million things to comment on, but two really important things.
Please.
One is a coherent sort of leftism, progressivism, socialism, democratic socialism, however people want to frame that. Like, I think you can have a coherent view where you care about things like the Green New Deal and also care about Black Lives Matter, but also realize that we're not going to abolish the police, but also want people to have health care. But I think that that's perfectly reasonable, and you're able to do it as long as you don't come across as an asshole. And I really think that like the biggest thing is like so many leftists run around and they just like come across as these insufferable people that you would never in a million years want to invite to a dinner party. And if you're not someone that I would like to,
are just waiting so that you slip up and don't use the right program.
Yes, like, and that kind of stuff is so unhelpful. And I think you can hold all of those positions coherently and do it in a way that does not turn off tons of people. That's number one. Number two, really quick. Nathan J. Robinson, who's the editor of Current Affairs, was just fired by The Guardian US this morning because he tweeted about Israel, a joking tweet about Israel getting funds from the United States in that last bailout package. You know, there was X amount of funds that went to foreign nations. Some of them went to Israel. Nathan J. Robinson made a joke about how no matter what the bill is, Israel always gets a new weapons system. And the editor from The Guardian US just fired him. Now, right-wing commentators and others, the Joe Rogans of the world, will go on and on and on about cancel culture and how bad it is. But the right-wing people who talk about cancel culture never say a word when people like Norman Finkelstein or Steven Saleta or Nathan J. Robinson, who've had their lives ruined because they criticized Israel and the treatment that Israel gives to Palestinian people, like that's never talked about. So again, if we're going to have these discussions, like let's have them in a real principled way. Like, let's not just try and find a way to just prove our little point to do whatever it is we want to do. Like, let's have a serious discussion. I just wanted to mention that because I just got that news this morning and I think it's important. Look, I'll say a couple things because I think there are things we get in some ways better than them. And there's things they didn't do as well as the generation, I think, of organizers from the 1930s or the 1880s, which were able to make even more significant economic gains. But in the 1960s, there was sort of this, how do I put this? I think there's tremendous organizing that's taken place in a few different decades in the United States, 1880s, 1930s, 1960s. And then now we have like a building up of new movements. One of the reasons why I think the 60s movement had much more traction than we did today were for primarily economic reasons. We were still in the midst of the so-called golden era of capitalism. To go to the UCLA in downtown Los Angeles in 1971 cost $50 a semester. Public schools and public universities were virtually free in half of the states in the United States. There's this sort of economic infrastructure, social welfare state that existed, and the economic opportunities that existed in the 1960s, right up until about the early 1970s, mid 1970s, and then we shift into this neoliberal era. But if you look back at the kind of economy that people were going into when they were getting out of school or coming back from Vietnam, today, everybody is working 2 or 3 jobs. They're in debt from school. They're in debt from credit cards. They're in debt from their car. Like, the economic situation for people today is like, you're in dire straits today compared to people back then. And I will also say they had an infrastructure of organizers from the 1930s who were still alive and engaged in that period. So when groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, SNCC, started in the South, or the Southern Christian Leadership Council, these organizations that eventually led the civil rights movement, these were people who came out of the Communist Party and the Socialist parties, the IWW, and the workers' organizations of the 1930s that really forced, and won the New Deal, the original New Deal. So these were people who had organizing experience following the Great Depression, who then mentored a whole new generation of activists and organizers who were coming about in the early 1960s with these new movements. Anyway, that's a long response, and there's a lot more to it. But I think that the economy, coupled with the experience from a previous generation of organizers and activists that we don't have, a lot of the lessons.
Generation X is particularly active in the streets. All of these groups, whether it's about climate change or whatever, maybe with the exception, I did go to one DSA meeting. I don't think they wanted to endorse me. There was more diversity there, but generally speaking, most activist groups and meetings that I find, there's usually the typical crowd that's retired, a lot of old folks. and then the bubbly teenagers that want to make a difference in the world, right, and save the turtles. But then you find that there aren't like late 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, and their guys in their 40s, and you're just thinking there is this. Okay, the people that actually have a possibility of changing things that are not retired and have not even gotten any experience, they're not engaging in our conversation. So what are we doing wrong, right? I'm pretty sure you've come across this problem with your organizing over there.
Oh God, yes. I mean, we've actively, to be honest with you, we have actively distanced ourselves from a lot of the ultra leftist organizations in our region because we've found that those organizations turn people off. And when you bring somebody in, like if you could bring in a 40-year-old worker from the local gas station or the local retail shop or something, or the local non-unionized factory, like they're going to come in after work. Most people are going to be like, look, I got limited time. Are you BSing me? What am I here for? Are you guys serious? Do you have a plan? Are you organized? Are you strategic? And are you going to waste our time? Because if you're going to waste any of my time, I got 2 kids to take care of. I just got off of work and I got stuff to do. Like, that's the kind of stuff that I see working class people want. They want people who are serious with a plan, who are accountable, disciplined, organized, not like, oh, hey, like maybe we'll get it done in a couple weeks, or like, I don't know, like it'll be.
And let's just waste a whole 2 hours on what our logo is going to be.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. No, you can't. It'll kill any movement or project. And yeah, it just, you can't have it. You can't have it. You just can't. We've done our best to like really distance ourselves from this kind of stuff. I mean, it's probably a conversation. If you want to have it in the future, I'd be more than happy. I should probably have you on our program and we can return the favor and I can just ask you questions, because then you can talk about how you feel about things. But yeah, I would like to do that because I think these are like the kind of conversations we need to have. And if people don't hear from people like you, like if people only hear from these people who are like, rad,
that actually make a living out of this, because let's not forget that a lot of these NGOs, a lot of these organizations, they're full of career people where they look like they're activists, but they have a salary.
100%. Now, one thing I'll say about that is in my experience, it is true that I think people sometimes need to be compensated for political work because they're taking time out of their days or whatever it is they're doing. Like, but to turn it into a professionalized class of people and a careerist sort of like endeavor, or like an ambitious endeavor, like I'm personally going to do this thing and I see it as like an individual accomplishment instead of like, I see myself as like a class of people who have collective interests, and like whether or not I make it as like a writer or as a effing radio host means nothing if my neighborhood is falling apart, if people don't have good jobs, if my family doesn't have healthcare. Like, who in their right mind could be happy about that? You know what I mean? Like, who could be happy about like, oh, I'm doing so well, and like, but nobody else is doing.
Race to believe that their individual success is the only thing that matters, and screw the community.
Yeah. Now that needs to be driven out of both our movement and, these I think the sort of broader culture, because it's destroying us in the midst of COVID. Like, it's totally destroying us.
To end things on a positive note, I do like how I heard one comment of yours, how you were saying that we need to also focus on good stuff, positive things that we have gotten right. Because at the end of the day, you're just so overwhelmed. Like if you just only exclusively have a diet of criticism and of activists telling you all day, oh, this person was deported. How do you see now that the Biden administration is deporting babies to Haiti? Like when you add all the bad stuff, you could be burnt out in the way that maybe you even get insensitive. You're like, guess what? I'm going to give up, because no matter how much I stress about it, every time I turn my back, the world just goes to shambles.
Yep. I totally agree. And I think the best way to do so is through action. So in other words, even to your comment earlier about younger people and cell phones and social media and all of this, the way that we look at it, Sergio Kochergan, who's the other co-founder of this space, and myself, who's a longtime, activist and my best friend, the way we look at it is like, look, we can complain and we can say, everybody's sitting at home, everybody's watching TV, nobody's doing anything except for our group of friends. Like, look at our group of friends. We're so much better than everyone else. Like, no, like that's not what we're interested in. Like, the thing we were interested in is like, if you're going to complain about it, okay, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? We're going to open a community center. So like, and then that immediately gives you something to like all right, now we've got events. Now we're connecting with artists. They can host their own events. We're connecting with a local music scene. Some of them jazz musicians, some hip hop, some hardcore, some heavy metal. Like they're doing their thing. Then you connect with the slam poetry people. Oh, now the poetry people are coming in and they're doing their thing. Like that, it creates new networks. And then like more and more of that vibrancy of like, hey, what are you doing? Oh, you've got an idea this weekend? Great. I've got an idea this weekend. Let's do something. Like for me, the best way to kill cynicism is through action. So like we could sit at home and be critics and pundits and all the rest, or we can create, like we can actually build and paint and develop things and build projects, or like we could, you know, be like critics. I'm not a big fan of Winston Churchill at all, but I think his quote about critics is really spot on. It's like, you could be somebody who just sits at home and writes about albums, or you can go make a fucking album. Like go make an album. Like I would rather be the person that someone's writing about, not the person writing about someone.
You're right. I like that. So to sum all of that,
sorry for the swearing, by the way.
The what?
For the swearing, I don't know if it's allowed on your program. I'm sorry.
Well, we're not PBS.
Same in the community. Like anything you want. It's like there's not enough art in my community. Well,
There's so much garbage in my community.
Yeah, it's anything. Like
I like that. Very positive. That works for today. So thank you, Vincent, so much for giving us your time and your ideas and your intellect. And I wish you the best of luck with your community center.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right.